Good morrow, everyone, and welcome to Shakespeare and Friends, the series in which we engage with some of the big questions surrounding Shakespeare and early modern history. I'm Darren Freebury-Jones.
I'm Rachel Aanstad, and today we are asking the question, what is the question we're asking? Is it really better to be a
Well,
is it really better to be a witty fool than a foolish wit? Isn't that the question?
quite foolish of us, but yes, the question is it really better to be a witty fool? So, what are your thoughts, Rachel?
Well, I think we answer that at the end of the episode. I think it'd be a spoiler if I if I said my obvious conclusion right now. Okay, so I want to mention that the background behind us, these are details from the fight between Carnival and Lent by Peter Bruegel. And this is an amazing painting and well worth a detailed look if you have the chance to look it up online or if you're really lucky, see it in person. Darren has a Carnival behind him. I have Lady Lent behind me, and it was this time during the year when people uh, could kind of break the normal societal bonds, and that was the gist of Carnival. That uh, authorities uh, would take a back seat and page boys and jesters and stuff would get to be in charge, and then in Lent you're supposed to be very ascetic, you're supposed to eat less and so on, and so this is the battle between those two kind of human poles of activity, of what's deemed appropriate behavior. And it's all kind of a matter of what time of the year it is, really, which one is okay to be. So that's what we've got going on behind us here. And I thought I would do kind of a quick discussion about the history of fools and the history of clowns and jesters and everything else. And then we're going to get into the nitty gritty about Shakespeare's fools. So, there have always been clowns and jesters and things like that. But in the medieval era, a certain style of clown was developed called the vice. And the vice would be a main character in these medieval pageants, which were put on by the Catholic Church and the guilds in the town, and often demonstrated stories from the Bible or stories that the Catholic Church had deemed to be sort of improving to humankind. And so a lot of times there would be these different wagons. This is a whole other fascinating topic, of course, but basically in the pageant, a guild would get to pick a particular story or a particular theme, and then they would take a wagon and they would decorate it with that theme. And then at the very end, the Hellmouth would come out. And this was this big, fancy, yawning, gaping devil's mouth. And uh, the Vice, who was the fool dressed in was not a devil, kind of tended to dress in motley or some kind of outrageous outfit. And it was the Vice's job to reveal the devil at the end of the play and pull them out of the hellmouth and then show the audience. And there would be cannons and pyrotechnics and Vice would threaten to drag, and demons would threaten to drag people from the audience, throw them in the hellmouth. Actors would go in the hellmouth, and it was this big deal. But it was the Vice's job to sort of mediate between the audience and the devil, and to sort of act as uh, an intercessor in terms of saying, hey, I know you're all sinners out there. I know you've all done things or are thinking about doing things that the priest doesn't want you to do. And I'm here to say you're a human being and it's okay. You know, you can go to the church and the church can save you from damnation and whatever, but also uh, it, you can be saved. You're not beyond redemption. And I think this was probably a really important role because you see this terrifying hellmouth and you hear these horrible things that could happen to you. You don't want people just giving up and going, "Oh, well, I'm damned. I guess I may as well just keep doing the damning things, right? Why even try? Why even bother to be good?" So, I think he served a very important role. And as uh, theater became more secularized and also as uh, monarchs kind of pulled more entertainment into their sort of private sphere, then the role of the allowed fool or the jester became very prominent. And the jester's job a lot of times is to speak truth to power. And that's still true. We still see our comedians, the good ones, speaking truth to power and mocking the powerful. Now, one of my very favorite, and I've got a note here, one of my very favorite jesters was Roland the Farter. He was what is known as a flatulist, and
Oh,
he lived in the 12th century, and he was a jester for King Henry II, who loved him. And in return for each year at Christmas, he was obliged to perform a jump, a whistle, and a fart all at the same time. And because he was so good at this,
this
and
is quite a party trick, Rachel, isn't it?
really, and because he was so consistent and reliable, King Henry II gave him 30 acres of land and all kinds of money. Like he was a superstar flatulist. He was amazing. So I want you to keep that in mind because Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, uh, who some people for some reason imagine could have written all of Shakespeare's plays, which you know, we barely discuss that because it seems silly to us. But anyway, Edward de Vere, he was at court and he bowed before the queen and just ripped one and was so embarrassed that he left. He didn't come back to London for 7 years. And then when he came back and bowed, what did she say? You look
It
like you
said,
got.
uh, uh, it's one of my favorite anecdotes. Queen Elizabeth said, "Oh, I had forgotten about the fart."
So to me, that is the definitive proof that De Vere did not write Shakespeare's plays. Because had Shakespeare farted like that, he would have asked for 30 acres. He wouldn't have been embarrassed.
Ah, yes.
Excuse me. He wouldn't have been embarrassed. He wouldn't have left London for 7 years. He would have chalked that up as a performance and tried to do it again every time he bowed before the Queen. So I think that's definitive proof. Uh, and in Shakespeare's plays, full of fart jokes, of course. But one of my favorite kind of stealth fart jokes that usually flies under the radar is that Viola means fart. And so in Twelfth Night, when one of the main characters is named Viola and the other one is Toby Belch,
Hmm.
Um, and there's a whole lot of other sort of slightly dicey associations in terms of um, eunuchs and that whole line of 16th century humor. But Yeah, Shakespeare was big into the fart jokes. So,
I love that. What I find so interesting about Viola is she's not named until Act Five, and she's such a ambiguous and
mm,
androgynous and fluid character. And she has a wonderful line, "I am not what I am," which is a line that Iago also speaks, which I just find an
yes.
interesting connection between those two ambiguous characters who find themselves in very different plays, generically speaking.
And yet both of them are being deceitful,
Oh yeah, yeah.
you know, one one for good reasons and one for evil reasons. So, yeah.
And
And
Iago's often equated to the vice figure as well, of course.
I can see that. I can see that for
Yeah.
sure. And then, Twelfth Night brings us right back around to uh, Carnival and, that time of year when society would kind of go upside down and people
Mm.
could exchange roles. And
This is something I found very interesting, is learning a bit more about the Feast of Fools,
mm-hmm,
which seems to be a sort of inversion. It's kind of a celebration with subdeacons, I
mm-hmm,
believe, and they're sort of parodying church traditions. And what I found really interesting in terms of that inversion of sort of normative societal roles were the connections with Epiphany Eve, with Twelfth Night. So
mm-hmm,
Shakespeare's Twelfth Night, I think it's very clever that, yes, you've got the play's title of Twelfth Night, but the play in so many respects actually holds a mirror up to those celebrations. And apparently the Feast of Fools and Epiphany Eve both derive from the Roman festival of Saturnalia. So with Epiphany Eve, usually celebrated 5th or 6th of January,
mm-hmm,
you'd have music, mass balls, general chaos, and you'd have a peasant or subdeacon who was elected to be the Lord of Misrule and would often be dressed colourfully, perhaps with bells tied to their legs. So it kind of reminds me a little bit of the movie series The Purge. That this is essentially something of a blowout. It's a
mm-hmm,
distraction from the perceived unfairness, we could say, of the feudal system, but it's temporary. This is Christmas is
mm-hmm,
coming to a close, and I think you see that in Shakespeare's comedy that you've got this topsy-turvy world of Illyria. You've got dukes mooning, whining, moping about, such as Duke Orsino and the Countess Olivia in deep mourning for seven
mm-hmm.
years. And then you've got characters like Sir Toby Belch ruling the roost, or the carnivalesque character of Feste. But at the end of the play, you do get a sense that by and large, those social boundaries, those class boundaries are actually reinforced, with a slight exception, I think, of Sir Toby Belch marrying uh, the serving lady Maria. That's slightly outside
Well,
of
I just
societal norms.
no, I don't think so because Mariah would have been, at the very least, high-level gentry, if not a noble herself,
Yeah,
because,
yeah.
a servant was not what we think of servants as now. Everyone served someone. That was just part of being a human being. And so the higher up the ladder you were, then the higher status your servants were, which is why, you have nobles attending on Elizabeth and and James. And then if you were a noble, then you would have had upper level gentry attending on you,
Mm,
and maybe even other nobles,
mm,
because you've got a spare third son, or a fourth unmarried daughter, or what have you. And just by birth order, they're going to automatically be of lower status
mm,
than somebody in their same class who's of a higher birth order. And so, they would go to each other's households and, take those roles. So I think, Mariah is a lot of times played with the assumption that she's like
She's,
a maid of all work or something, and not at all. She would have been very highborn. And
mm,
so Toby marrying her, I I think uh, the funny part about it is that it took him so long.
mm,
He clearly needed somebody to look after him.
mm.
And she cared about him a great deal. And so, it's good that he got around to it and figured out that he ought to put a ring on it. Um,
It's very apt that we were talking about that famous phrase from Elizabeth. I had forgotten about the fart because I just had the bells ringing in my head when you were speaking then that actually I had attended a talk by the scholar Alison Flynn who drew my attention to that
mhm.
fact. So really, I guess those rigid class boundaries are pretty much reinforced, and then you have Malvolio with his absurd aspirations of marrying
Yes, yes,
a noblewoman, and he acts as a comic antagonist, standing outside of the play's happy resolution, as does Sir Andrew Aguecheek, who is
yes.
left with a
Poor,
broken head
poor
and is
Aggie cheek.
penniless. And I was adored once too, one of the most
Oh,
heartbreaking lines in Shakespeare, I
and
think.
it's really hard to like Toby Belch after he treats Aggie Treek so badly at
Yeah.
the end of the play.
And
And
it reminds me of the dynamic between Iago and Roderigo, actually,
mm,
where you have these villains using their counterparts as walking ATMs, essentially.
well, and I want to be careful because gosh, I love Twelfth Night so much. But I do want to point out that first of all, Malvolio he threatened he threatens Feste, he threatens Mariah to turn them out basically in the middle of winter, or
Mm,
depending how you count time, even the beginning of spring, um, turn them out of the household, which could be, a sentence of starvation if they're unable to find somewhere else. We don't know what their life circumstances are. Now, Feste obviously had another gig at Count Orsino, so he probably would have been okay. But nonetheless, this was their home. This is where they wanted to be. And I want to point out, too, that Malvolio raised Olivia, that not only was he likely much older than her, but he had been kind of a father figure as a steward. He would have been in charge of raising her from practically the time she was born. And so his kind of lusting after her, it's more than a problem that she's of a different class. The problem is that, you know, he is the only one she has left in the world to kind of protect her, right? Her Uncle Toby's no good, clearly. Um, who does that leave her with? Feste? Feste ends up being the one who tries to protect her. So Malvolio's lusting after her, it's more than him having the hots for his employer.
mm,
It's him moving his role out of being a protector, and with wardships and everything else, that gets to a real sticky conversation in terms of
mm,
medieval and Elizabethan um, pairing
mm,
traditions. Let's put it that
mm,
way.
mm.
It gets complicated. Anyway, we're talking about fools. So, but since he is the foolish wit here, um,
Yes, and the character who most closely resembles the Lord of Misrule, visually speaking.
mm,
He's quite a puritanical figure and is referred to as a
mhm.
kind of Puritan by Mariah. And then he is the character who is dressed up colourfully, with cross-gartered
So
and
true.
stockings. It's hilarious. Another example of inversion, I think.
Well, and something to remember is that clowns typically they dress in the clothing of the past. So even
Mm,
today we see clowns with big white ruffs, around their neck and,
Mm,
crazy hats and stuff. It's all very Elizabethan and medieval. And, back then during the Renaissance, then they wore even older clothes, often a costume that would kind of look like an old churchman or something like that, old ecclesiastical clothes and
mm.
and stuff
I
like
do
that.
live by the church, as Feste puts it. Yeah,
Exactly. And
yeah.
this does kind of lead me to something that I wanted to talk about in terms of Shakespeare's fools, which is that, like the Vice, they act as a go-between, as a kind of psychopomp between this world, and the underworld. And when Feste interacts with Malvolio after Toby and Mariah have put Malvolio into a dark room, and they say they're going to bind him, but I don't think they do because he's able to write a letter later. But anyway, they put him into a dark room, and Feste comes in and pretends to be Sir Topas, the priest, and he starts asking him all these questions. Do you believe in the philosophy of Pythagoras, basically, is what he says. I'm butchering the line, but he's goes through all these questions. And the fascinating thing is that these questions are very similar to the kind of generic initiation rites that were practiced at the time in these sort of secret societies. And Pythagoras, as strange as this sounds, Pythagoras was a ancient Greek philosopher who was so long ago we're not even sure how much of him is real and how much of him is, apocryphal. But uh, they didn't eat beans. Maybe they were afraid of farting. Who knows? And but they were otherwise vegetarians. And any time that you voluntarily chose not to eat meat, that was considered puritanical. That was considered kind of ascetic behavior. And so, odd as this sounds, the Pythagoreans were thought of as Puritans.
Mm,
So, they say, oh, well, Malvolio is a kind of a Puritan. And
mm.
so when Feste starts asking him all these questions about Pythagoras, and Malvolio goes, "Oh, I in no way approve of you know these wacky Pythagoreans." Uh, that's when Feste decides that he's a poser. That's when Malvolio fails the test. Basically, he fails the initiation, and Feste goes off. Uh, the last thing that people were supposed to do during these initiations. And if you, I think the remnants of these initiation rites can be found in Freemasonry now. Um, it's not really a secret what their rites are. But at the end of, well, there's a few things. One, you're supposed to not talk to women. And so what does Malvolio do? He says he wants to talk to a woman. He wants to talk to Olivia. So again, he's failed, and he says he wants to write. Now, this is the last part of the initiation where you sit down and you basically write your manifesto. And then, the judges take your manifesto and decide for sure whether or not you've passed the initiation. So when Feste goes to get pen and ink from Malvolio, they're enacting the last part of this initiation. And he brings him the pen and the paper, and Malvolio writes the letter, and that redeems him. But he has failed the test, and he leaves because he is no longer part of the culture there. He has trespassed and found wanting and been expunged at that point. And to me, that's in a sense the real purpose of Carnival is that if somebody is abusing their power, this is a chance to mock them into
Mm,
getting the heck out of Dodge.
mm.
Uh, and bringing up things that you might normally get horsewhipped for, and
Mm.
revealing some of these inequities and uh, you know abuses of power.
And it's interesting that having formed of the ruthless and most exquisite Sir Topas, that Feste actually compares himself to the old vice figure of medieval
Right.
morality plays when we're thinking of iniquity.
Exactly. Exactly. So I adore Festi. Um, he's absolutely one of my favorite characters, and there's always more jokes in his lines every time you reread those.
Mm.
And he was played by Robert Armin, we think, right? And Robert Armin, we believe, was relatively new to the company, and unlike Will Kemp, who had gone before, who we can talk about in a minute, but Robert Armin trained as a goldsmith. That was his day job, and the goldsmiths were really high up in the guild hierarchy, and as such, they studied a lot of esoteric lore. They were sort of scholars. And, these the guilds had these kind of quasi rituals as part of their culture. And so the goldsmiths were very learned. And I would not be surprised if Robert Armin contributed a lot to Feste's lines. We know he was a
Mm.
writer,
Mm.
you know.
And that's a fascinating point actually, is that you do have a lot of actors who play clowns or who play fools on the stage who are also writers. So yes, he wrote works such as A Nest of Ninnies. You also have a very interesting Elizabethan playwright who is also believed to have played clown roles, named Robert Wilson. And he was responsible for plays such as The Three Ladies of London, as well as The Three Ladies and The Three Lords of London. And what's quite interesting when you look at his surviving play texts is that they have a certain extempore quality. You get the
Hmm.
sense with certain scenes that these are sketches to be filled in through improvisation. And very interestingly, you've got an actor who is believed to have played clowns writing in such a way. And there's a play that I associate with Robert Wilson. It's an anonymous play that I think there's a pretty good case for his potentially having authored. And it's called An Act to Know a Knave. And the title page for An Act to Know a Knave celebrates the applauded merriment. So this is a highlight that is designed to grab reader attention. The applauded merriments of Will Kemp and the men of Gotham. And if you actually consult the play text, you'll be very disappointed at the moment in which these men of Gotham greet the king as he enters Nottinghamshire. It's very sparse.
Mm.
So it does seem to have been this moment that the play text is only giving us a minor snapshot. We're really not
Hmm.
getting the full picture in terms of the visual and verbal display and just how much mirth, just how much merriment was going on in that moment with Will Kemp. And I think there were probably a lot of opportunities for improvisation in Elizabethan plays in particular
Hmm.
that we don't have access to
Yeah.
anymore. These are pretty much whispers lost in the squall of time, I think.
Well, and a lot of it would have been very physical humor, right? Especially for Will Kemp, he was known as a
Yeah,
physical clown. He did
yeah.
that 9 days dance. That was
Wonder.
his that 9 days wonder where he danced from where? From London to
So he danced, he Morris danced the 110 miles from London to Norwich.
wow.
And this was his exit from the Lord Chamberlain's men, which is quite a prolonged exit from a playing company. And then he wrote about it, yes, in
Hmm.
9 Days Wonder. And it's interesting that in that work, Will Kemp refers to his enemies as shake rags. So potentially a pen on Shakespeare's name, and potentially this was quite an acrimonious exit. And a lot of scholars have considered Hamlet's advice to the players, let those that play your clowns speak no more than is set down for them, to be something of a jibe at Will Kemp. And Hamlet continues to speak about clowns who will begin to laugh, to set off a quantity of barren spectators. And Hamlet really drives the point home, actually. He says, that's villainous. It shows a pitiful ambition in the fool. So who knows? We try to read between the lines, just as we try to imagine the merriment of the men of Gotham in a play like Anacton A, for instance.
Well, and they wouldn't be the first people to have creative differences,
Of
right?
course,
You know,
of
can you
course.
imagine how, what a pressure box being in that kind of company must have been? You
Mm,
know, these are people, they see each other all the time. You know, they're all interconnected in terms of uh, you know, not so much Shakespeare, but marrying each other's sisters
yes.
and so on. And it was a comparatively small town. I mean, 200,000 people is was the size of London at the time, and the theater community must have been considerably smaller than that. And
Mm,
you get tired of people. You get sick of them.
yeah. No, I
Personalities
think it
clash.
was, yeah, it was an intense, uh, collaborative world,
Mm,
but also a world of commercial rivalry. And I think
yeah.
it's very useful to have a grasp of the historical context in terms of Shakespeare's company's personnel, because
Hmm.
I think Shakespeare always had his actors at the forefront of his
Oh,
mind when
yes.
he was writing his plays. And we see that with Will Kemp. He was incredibly important for Shakespeare. And you have Kemp's name substituted for Dogbree's in editions
Hmm.
of Much Ado About Nothing. You also have the direction in the 1599 quarto of Romeo and Juliet, enter Will Kemp. So
Yes.
we know through that direction that Kemp would have played Peter, and Peter is a very small role. So again, that might have been a role that was larger on the stage. That there might very well have been opportunities for Kemp to improvise beyond the dialogue that survives to us today.
And can you imagine, here's Romeo and Juliet, and it's a really interesting play in that it starts out as a comedy and ends as a tragedy. And then here
Mm,
you've got to shove this clown in, and
mm,
he has this scene that really relates to nothing.
mm,
It's the easiest scene in Shakespeare to cut, as far as I'm concerned, because
mm,
nothing is lost by
mm,
doing so. He just shows up. It's almost like an intermission show where he's
mm,
talking to the musicians, and you assume he's got a song and dance routine of some
mm,
kind. Uh,
mm,
but you can imagine having this guy, and you're like, "Oh, I gotta write a scene for for Will
mm,
Kemp."
mm, mm.
It's hard, but you gotta please your fans and you gotta keep them working. So,
But all we have is the text. That for all we know,
right.
that scene might have been one of the highlights of the play for Elizabethan
Oh,
audiences.
sure, sure, but wouldn't that be annoying to the playwright?
Ah,
And we think that Will Kemp, that he played Falstaff and Bottom, right?
mm,
All these kind of big-bodied, big, big movement, broad humor
mm,
kinds of parts. And
mm.
then that when Robert Armin came along, then we get our Feste and our Touchstone and Lear's Fool, uh, possibly Iago. Um,
Is interesting that it's particularly in terms of stage directions and speech prefixes that the terms clown and fool are almost interchangeable in Shakespeare's
yes,
plays, but a
yes,
lot of scholars see a big distinction, and I think there is, and it's because of that changeover around 1599 from Will Kemp to Robert Armin, two very different comic talent. So a lot of the clownish figures in Shakespeare's early plays that they come across as country bumpkins
Mm-hmm.
or rustic zanies. And yes, you have the likes of Dogberry, Bottom,
Mm-hmm.
uh, Peter in Romeo and Juliet, maybe Lancelot Gobbo in The Merchant of Venice. And
Mm.
then we see a real change with Touchstone in As You Like It. And he is an intellectual and he's a courtly fool and he can be bitterly satirical. And he's been described as rancidly vicious. And the more intense his rancidity, the more he is able to test the true gold of
Mm.
Rosalind's spirit. I'm paraphrasing Harold Bloom's Purple Prose in the invention of the humor there. But you do see a very different a foolish character there. And I think Robert Armin took a more intellectual approach to
Mm-hmm.
foolery, really. And he also had a considerable talent for singing. So Will
Yes.
Kemp's talent, I think, lay primarily in physical
Mm-hmm.
comedy. And we shouldn't forget that Armin also would have played the roles vacated by Kemp. So it's interesting when you get to
Yes.
Measure for Measure that you've almost got a Dogberry clone in the role of
Mm.
Elbow, who relies on malapropisms for humor. But Touchstone, Feste, I think, is a wonderful character. And there's a scholar named Alan Preiss Jones who says that Feste embodies the interplay of light and shadow that makes Twelfth Night memorable. And you were talking about him as a psychopomp. I
Yes.
think he occupies this liminal space between the
Mm.
actors and characters on stage and the audience. And some productions will have Feste remaining on stage almost throughout the duration of the
Mm.
play, kind of like this Lord of Misrule presiding over the festivities. But he's a character who speaks truth to power.
Yes.
He compares Duke Orsino to changeable taffeta. And he has this wonderful exchange with Olivia, where he's essentially saying, "Why are you grieving your brother?" He says, "I think your brother is in hell." And she says, "I know, fool, he is in heaven." And he says, "Well, what's the issue then?
Yeah.
Why are you refusing to see any blokes for 7 years?" And then there's that meta theatrical quality with him playing Sir
Mm-hmm.
Topas, which is an absolute joy in performance for an actor. I think getting to play that role, getting to play Feste and then impersonating the local curate.
And he gets to, he's the last to speak at the end of the play.
Yes.
And typically in plays at that time, and certainly in Shakespeare's plays, often the highest ranked person spoke at the end.
Mm,
And this is again part of this, this feast of misrule, is
mm,
that the highest ranked person in the play is Feste. And
mm,
then when we see the same thing in Midsummer Night's Dream, where Puck ends the play.
mm,
Uh, so I it seems to me that there was this sort of shift at the time. And, part of this, I think, is due to the overall sort of secularization of the culture, of people
mm,
moving away from the great chain of being and this sort of strict hierarchy and doing it very slowly.
mm,
It took a few hundred years, really, to move from the idea of who has value,
mm,
who is important. And in both those cases, you know, we get we get the fools, we get the jesters. Puck is kind of an Armin type of fool in a way. He does this sort of malicious compliance,
mm,
by getting by dosing Lysander with the flower.
mm,
Well, you said he's dressed like an Athenian, isn't
mm,
that enough, And
mm,
causes all the plot complications that basically make the play.
Mm,
There's something else that I'd like to talk about though with Falstaff, because Falstaff is amazing, and
mm,
how his character, uh, became so popular theoretically that, and I think we talked about this in the last episode when we were talking about
yeah.
Falstaff, that poor Shakespeare had to resurrect him like, Sir Conan Doyle and uh,
Yes.
Sherlock. Um,
Yeah.
but I think I think Falstaff is really interesting because he's so carnal, he's so visceral, and he's sort of this inside out character in that all the things that we would normally try to hide, our appetites for gluttony and sex and our urge to run away from danger, all these things that people at the time, maybe more than today even, really tried to keep inside, really tried to uh, say that they had that under control. And Falstaff is like this cathartic denial of that kind of self-control. And that's really the role of clowns and fools, right? Is e- to expose that humanity and to say, this is who we are. And secretly we're all like this. I don't care how, what kind of airs you put on. I don't care if
Mm,
you're, you know, a noble or a priest. Uh, you've got this inside you. And that tradition, it goes all the way back to Chaucer, right? Who kind of makes everybody into a clown, makes
mm,
everybody into a fool.
mm,
Um, and Shakespeare, and I'm sure other playwrights too, I feel like he rely very heavily on Chaucer
mm.
to kind of pull those archetypes all the way out from the medieval. What what do you what am I trying to say here? Um, I see Shakespeare using humor, uh, often in these very serious plays. Let's talk Mercutio, right? Um,
Mm,
making jokes as he's dying.
mm.
And he's using humor very skillfully to sort of, instead of making everything straight down. I mean, even in Macbeth, there's humor. You know,
Mixed mode writing was very popular during the period, and for me, Shakespeare's tragedies in particular are often a roller coaster of emotion. So you mentioned Macbeth, and you've got the entrance of the porter, and some critics simply dismiss this moment as the interpolation of plebeian humour.
mm,
But have a look at where that Porter's speech falls. It
mhm,
falls following the act of regicide, the worst of political crimes, the murder of King Duncan, and subsequent to the Porter's exit, you then have the revelation of the king's murder. And I
mhm,
think those high peaks of tragedy stand even higher because of the
mhm,
Porter's entrance. And a lot of people forget there's a clown in Othello as well. He only has 14 lines, I think, and it's largely a knob gag, but worth having a look at where that character's entrance falls as well. You've just had
mhm,
Michael Cassio being demoted by Othello following too much consumption of the devil's ingredient, following his getting inebriated, and then following the clown scene, you get Michael Cassio pleading his
mm,
case. So I think the fools and the clowns serve really important purposes in terms of the very tone of a play and generically speaking. So Shakespeare, yes, he incorporates humor because I feel his his tragedies would feel less tragic,
Mhm,
less dark. Did you not undergo those differences in
mhm.
emotions that Shakespeare can make you laugh one moment and cry another?
So, did the other playwrights of the era, did they have that kind of timing in their work as well? Or is this something
Y-
that Shakespeare did unusually
Oh,
well?
is that's a great question, and a play that springs to mind that I think achieves the balance less effectively than Shakespeare, if I'm being honest, would be Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faustus.
Mm,
That most people, when they think of Dr. Faustus, they think of the tragedy. They think almost purely of the tragic narrative. That you've got that De Cassibus tradition, you've got Dr. Faustus's rise and his fall, but it's worth remembering that this play has something of a mirror structure, and those scenes involving Faustus are mirrored by the clownish behavior of a stable hand named Robin and his friend Rafe. So you have Faustus using dark arts, and he's got Mephistopheles at his bidding for 24 years. He has these huge aspirations, and Faustus essentially ends up playing parlor tricks.
mhm,
And that's what you see with the clowns, that they steal one of Faustus's books. They're also conjuring demons. So you're getting a sense, I think, of parallel foolishness there. And also a play that is structured around master and servant relationships. So it's very cleverly plotted, Dr. Faustus, but considerably less subtle than the kind of interposition of humor you see in Shakespeare's tragedies.
mhm. Well, humor always interests me, and I've always been more partial to Shakespeare's comedies
Mm,
because they're so subversive. I
mm,
think they're very serious plays, and I think they were much riskier than
mm,
the tragedies were for the most part, maybe with the
mm,
exception of Richard II. Uh, but they get dismissed a lot, or
mm.
were in the past in scholarship because it's like, oh, it's just a bunch of jokes. Well, jokes come from tension, and
Yes.
they only work if you trespass over what people are comfortable discussing and feeling at the moment. And
Mm,
I was very shocked when I was in college and started studying comedy seriously at how intentional it is. I think, if a comedian is good, it all looks very spontaneous and
mm,
accidental even, that they do this and they do that. And that's especially true in pratfalls, right? I think that's where we get that idea that it's sort of an accident, that these things appear funny to us, but they're really very structured. And
mm.
if you watch a comedian, like Jon Stewart or Stephen Colbert, or I'm trying to think of an English one, David Mitchell, I think has incredible timing. There's this sort of bump a bump a bump a bum, bump a bump a bump a bum, bump a bump a bump a bum. And i- once you see that rhythm, you cannot unsee it. And you see it in the early Greek plays, Aristophanes, Lysistrata, and the birds, uh, clearly had that rhythm down. And then, we had a long stretch of uh, a different kind of comedy, right? They even called it the new comedy. And it, that was sort of more expositional, right? You've got a funny character, a funny dressed person, uh, somebody who is okay to laugh at, because they were female or foreign or disabled or whatever it was. And so this is the whole gist of kind of the clown humor. And then when we get into these fools, then they're working much more with that rhythm and with the timing and everything else. And so Shakespeare has to provide that rhythm and timing himself before he gets Robert Armin. But then once he has Robert Armin there, he can have this really vicious touchstone clown
mm, mm,
and mess around a bit more, I feel like, with the structure of the play itself. It's like
mm.
he's freer to experiment. And so then uh we get the Tempest and we get a Winter's Tale and all these other plays that don't feel as tidily structured, let's say, as Midsummer does,
Mm.
or some of the other plays. But we're getting kind of in the weeds here
No, no,
a little bit.
I agree. I'm a huge fan of the tragedies in particular.
Uh-huh.
But I also love the comedies. And what I can say from personal experience is it's harder to write comedy and
Mm-hmm.
it's more difficult to perform comedy as well because with the tragedy, you're on stage, you can assume it's going well if the audience aren't responding.
Mm-hmm.
But with a comedy, you have instant feedback, and
Mm-hmm.
I think with Shakespeare's comedies that we cannot dismiss them as a string of jokes. A play like Twelfth Night is tonally disparate, and Viola has a line that for me encapsulates Twelfth Night. She says smiling in grief. And it's a play that
Mm.
begins with excessive grief that
Yes.
you have the Countess Olivia, that she's lost her father and she's lost her brother. And very interesting what you were saying earlier about Feste having the concluding lines of the play, because he has a song, The Rain It Raineth Every Day, which is a song that we also find in King Lear.
Mm-hmm.
And there has been some debate, did Armin play the fool in King Lear? I think it's
Seems likely. Yeah. Yeah.
highly likely.
Yeah.
And I think one of the great things about the fool, we were talking about speaking truth to power. I also feel that the fool can articulate criticisms of characters that we might have as audience
Mm.
members. And the fool is absolutely integral to King Lear's realization, and we could argue redemption, that, as Kent tells him in the very first scene of the play, thy youngest daughter does not love thee least. I think the fool
Mm-hmm.
assists with Lear's realization. And then once he has performed his dramatic function, he disappears in quite enigmatic circumstances. And he has another very curious speech where he says, this prophecy Merlin shall make, but I live before his time. So again, you're getting the sense of this fool situated in this liminal space, that he is within the tragic narrative, but also operating somewhat outside of it as well.
What is that? Do you have off the top of your head that line of the fool where he just before he goes? Because I've seen productions where the fool has hung himself or he's committed
Yes,
suicide.
I have as well.
And
Yeah.
and I think that take is wrong. I'm just going to straight up say wrong,
Mm,
bad, uh,
mm,
because basically, and I'm sorry, I don't remember it, but basically, what he says at the end is, "You've lost the plot, Lear." you know,
mm,
and I can't help you anymore.
mm,
And so I'm out of here because this situation looks dangerous to me. So, to my mind, and for those of you watching, I will have put the line up here so you can read it yourself. But
Doesn't he say, I'll go to bed at noon?
yes, okay, thank you. So that line comes from Pythagoras. Comes from
Mm,
Pythagoras's maxims, and Pythagoras's maxims were sort of a kind of a list of guides of how to behave in the world. And so you weren't supposed to go to bed at noon. If you said, I'm going to bed at noon, basically that meant I quit. I'm quitting my job.
mm,
I'm quitting my responsibilities. I'm just going to go to bed at noon. And
mm,
so by him saying that there, uh, he's saying, I'm going to go work for some other king who's clearly not as doomed as
mm,
you are. Um, now, I guess he could be saying that he's going to go kill himself. But I don't see any evidence in the text
Mm.
for the fool deciding to do that. I just don't see any
You have
motivation
that
for that.
curious line from Lear towards the end of the play where he says, "My poor fool is hanged." That some people see the word fool as an affectionate term for Cordelia, and some see it as
Hmm.
a reference to the fool.
Yeah.
It's the gap. Emma Smith writes about the gappiness of Shakespeare, and the reason I love plays like King Lear and Hamlet in particular
Hmm.
is in terms of critical analysis and interpretation. I visualize them as pieces of cartoon cheese, that they're full of gaps, that they're full of
Yes.
holes,
Yes. And
and I love to feast on them every time I read them, every time I see them
it's
in
the fun
performance again.
part. It's the fun part.
Yeah.
And let me be clear. I approve of anybody who produces Shakespeare anywhere. You want to hang the fool, hang the fool. I support you. But
Hang kittens. No, hang puppies. I was thinking of Iago. Yeah, yeah.
um, my feeling is it, I'm not implying that any Shakespeare I've seen has been bad, but my feeling is that even the worst Shakespeare is better than no Shakespeare.
Mm,
That as long as Shakespeare is being performed, no matter how how many full of holes it is, and how many of those holes are perhaps uh, inappropriately taken advantage of, so to speak, um,
mm,
that it's all good. It's all good
mm.
because Shakespeare would have just been thrilled that we're still talking about him and enjoying his work over 400 years later. So,
I think you talk about enjoying Shakespeare's humor. I think there's lots of other playwrights who deserve to still be talked about as well. So one
hmm.
playwright who I find quite hilarious is Robert Greene, and you've got him engaging, I think, with Marlowe's Dr. Faustus in his
Mm,
Magus or magician play, Friar Bacon and Friar Bungay. And you have this hilarious clown in that play called Miles, who's serving Friar Bacon. And I
mm,
think acts as through rustic humor, so something of a counter to the academic hubris that we see
hmm.
in other characters. And you have this huge automaton, this brazen head that the friar asks Miles to he says, I'm very tired, I'm going to go to sleep. If the head talks, wake me up. And the head does talk. It says,
Hmm.
time is. But Miles isn't very impressed by its vocabulary. He doesn't think the brazen head saying time is warrants waking his master up. And then the head says time was. And he says, "Oh, what kind of invention is this? Your head, it can only speak two words at once." And then the head says, something along the lines of time is past. And an arm appears, according to one of Robert Greene's many ludicrous stage directions, clutching a hammer and smashes the brazen head. So you've got there something of a, a simpleton
Mm.
fool. You've also got a courtly fool in that play, Rafe Simnel. And there's something of a distinction to be made, isn't it, between the idea of a natural fool, which I
Hmm.
believe is a fool said to have an intellectual
Oh,
disability,
yes, let's talk about
and
that.
an artificial fool, or an
An
allowed
allowed
fool,
fool.
as Olivia
Yes.
says in Twelfth Night.
Yes, an allowed fool. Yes, a natural fool was, as we were kind of discussing a little bit earlier, somebody who was disabled or somebody who uh, was configured, their body was configured differently than the norm.
Mm,
And so, of course, you have a lot of, dwarvish people or little people, whichever term you prefer. I understand both are acceptable to the community. Um, who often found work as natural fools. Uh,
mm.
Another kind of natural fool would be somebody with an intellectual disability.
Oh, yeah.
And, you know, in a sense, um, it's better than exposing them on a hillside. They're cared for and fed and, um, otherwise looked after. I'm sure it wasn't always a great life. Sometimes they got beat up and kicked because people thought that was funny to do. So uh, when uh, when Malvolio is picking on Festi, he basically said, all such a fool, he's almost natural, as if
Mm,
to say that his humor doesn't come from his intellect, but comes from a disability of some kind.
mm.
And them's fighting words for Festi at that
Oh
point.
yeah.
He's so offended. And anybody would be under those circumstances, but unfortunately, the meaning is lost some 400 years later when
Mm,
somebody says, "Oh, he's a natural fool." We don't go,
mm,
"Oh,"
mm.
today's audiences, we go,
And a barren rascal.
a barren
I
rascal."
marvel that my ladyship takes such delight, such a barren rascal.
Oh, yeah,
And then the whirligig of time really does bring in its revenges,
does
doesn't it?
bring in
The
its
Feste,
revenges.
Feste certainly gets revenge by the end of the play. Yes.
There is one last of Shakespeare's fools that I want to talk about, which is Yorick,
Yeah. Yes.
who in a way is sort of the ultimate psychopomp, right? He's
Mm,
come back from beyond.
mm,
And it to me signifies how hopeless Hamlet is, how hopeless his state is, because he doesn't even have a fool
mm,
to guide him through life. His his fool is gone. He's a skull. And the
mm,
best poor Yorick can do for him is sit there grinning, um,
mm.
in his
And
skull.
some scholars consider Yorick to be a reference to Richard Tarleton, and I think
Hmm.
we'd be doing a huge disservice if we didn't mention Dick Tarleton in an episode about
Definitely.
fools, because he was hugely famous and could apparently tickle audiences pink without saying so much as a word. And what I like about the anecdotes concerning Tarleton is you get a sense of him sometimes being heckled, and he was great at a put down and often came up with doggerel verse and would apparently stay behind after a play had concluded to banter with the audience. So is Yorick alluding to Richard Tarleton? Is Yorick potentially in some way alluding to the departure of Will Kemp? Uh, is Yorick alluding to anything beyond the confines of Shakespeare's play? Who knows? But it's a fascinating moment, and for me,
Hmm.
it's the real moment of transformation for Hamlet.
Yes.
That grave digger scene
Yes.
that he has spent the entire play musing on death, the undiscovered country, and I think in that moment he just comes to recognize the inevitability of it, that
Hmm.
death is everywhere. It's omnipresent. It's omniscient. It's going to get you whether you're Alexander the Great or a pauper down the
Hmm.
road. And for me, it really is one of the key scenes in that marvelous play. And it's lovely that it's a tragedy, and yet that scene revolves around humor. We've got the clownish figures of the
Exactly.
grave diggers and this lovely account of Yorick being able
Hmm.
to set a table on a raw.
Exactly. There is one more fool. There's Thersites in Troilus and Cressida, and people in general aren't familiar with that play because it's not performed very much, and I won't go too deeply into it. But I'm going to be on the History of European Theater podcast
Ah.
uh, soon, talking about Troilus and Cressida, and
Oh,
so
marvelous.
that'll be available. That's Philip Rowe's podcast, and I recommend that highly to everyone. It's
I do too. It's
definitely,
a fantastic podcast,
oh,
and Philip is just a wonderful host.
and so knowledgeable.
Oh yeah.
I rely on his episodes often
Mm,
to refresh my mind on
mm,
uh, on plays and things like that. But Thersites is was Homer's invention, and
mm.
he speaks truth to power. He
mm,
he says to Agamemnon, "You're full of shit." You know, you're ruining everything. You're screwing it all up. And he's right. And then, he gets beat up for his pains, but uh,
mm,
one of the first fools to speak truth to power has to be Thersites. And
mm.
in our oldest known epic for Europe, certainly for Western Europe, Homer is. So, all right. I feel like we
Well, we've spoken a lot
have
about
we have we missed
Shakespeare's
anybody?
fools and
Mhm.
clowns and dramatists preceding Shakespeare. We talked a bit about natural fools. Will
Mhm.
Somers is another natural fool who served during the reign of Henry VIII, as well as Edward VI. He could make Mary the First laugh. He retired
Mhm.
when Queen Elizabeth came to the throne. And Will Somers provides the chorus for Thomas Nash's play,
Mm.
Somers' Last Will and Testament. So quite interesting that we have an example there of a dramatized courtly fool playing something of a choric function that I think looks ahead
Mhm.
to Shakespeare. But also thinking subsequent to Shakespeare, and to go back to what we were saying about fools and clowns who were also writers. You had William Rowley, who was a playwright and also a clown, and often played, to be politically incorrect, what is sometimes referred to as fat clown parts.
Mm.
So he played roles such as the Fat Bishop in Thomas Middleton's A Game at Chess, and Plum Porridge in Middleton's The Inner Temple Mask. And Rowley's fascinating because he often writes clown roles for himself.
Mhm.
So post Shakespeare, you're seeing the centrality found through Rowley's roles, and one of Rowley's plays is The Birth of Merlin, which
Mm.
was spuriously attributed to Shakespeare as well. Read The Birth of Merlin, you'll be able to tell in a moment, I think, that
That it's
Shakespeare
not
had no
Shakespeare.
involvement in it. But it's bonkers. It's one of my favorite early modern plays, actually. So it dramatizes the birth of Merlin, and Merlin is born with the ability to speak magic powers and a fully grown beard, which is something I
Nice.
didn't achieve until at least the age of 8. But the clown in that play, he assists his sister, who has a name worthy of a Carry On movie, Joan Go To It. And Joan Go To It uh, sleeps with a devil, a gentleman who had horrible hooves, and Merlin is her son. So the
Mm.
clown in the birth of Merlin is actually the uncle of Merlin. So I feel that only
Wow.
only a playwright who was playing the clown could produce such a
Wow.
role.
Wow.
So I
Wow.
would recommend, if you haven't, checking out a bit of William Rowley, because he was a fascinating figure and also
Mhm.
a deeply collaborative playwright who worked with almost anyone on the Jacobean scene.
And we should mention too that there were many female fools and clowns. It was not at all a gendered profession. One that we know for sure was Jane Fool, also known as Jane the Fool, and she was the court fool of Catherine Parr and
Mm.
Mary the First. Uh, Women and men had their own courts. Often they were kind of segregated that way. And the female courts had a female fool that, you know, just like the male courts had a male fool. But of course, we don't hear as much about them. But we see Jane Fool, we believe, in that there's a famous painting. It's Henry VIII with um, all of his children are in the painting, and one of his wives. I'm not sure. Sorry.
Not sure which one.
I'm sorry, I'm not
The
sure
one,
which
the
one.
one with a head.
Yeah, at least at the time of the painting. I'm thinking Jane Seymour, but it could be Catherine Parr. In any event, uh, one of the women in the painting is thought to be um, their fool, who was included in this family portrait. And so, to me, that kind of states how how sort of intimate that relationship was
Mm.
between a monarch and their fools. That, in a sense, this was one of the few people they could trust to tell them the truth and to help them deal with things. Um, I've been reading so much history, it kind of all mixes up in my head. But I recently read a story about the fool who went before one of the English kings after some naval disaster with the French, and everybody was really didn't want to tell this king how terribly this naval engagement had gone. And so the fool went before the king and said, "Those French were cowards and were not at all interested in jumping into the water like our brave English soldiers did." So, if you had to give the king bad news, you really helped to find a fool to do it, because a king in a temper might do something bad. So, all righty, have we come to a conclusion? Is it
I
is it
think
better to
so.
be a witty fool?
Than a foolish wit. Yes, I
I
think
think
it seems.
so.
I think so. It seems like a paradox, but so often
Hmm.
the foolish characters are the most intellectual, and uh, in terms of the characters on stage. But I also feel
Hmm.
that the fools not only speak truth to power, but they also speak to us. That there's something of an umbilical
Yes,
cord between the
yes.
audience and the fools in Shakespeare's plays in particular.
Back to that role as the vice, where they're the
Yes,
intercessor between
yes,
our human nature that we
yeah,
cannot escape, and our aspirations of, the kind of people that we want to be. And
yeah,
I think it's worth saying that a wit was somebody uh, who was considered, educated, an academic, or a very well educated priest or something like that. And, there was some tension at the time, right, between the university wits and Shakespeare and, oh gosh, what's his name? Your buddy Thomas Kidd,
Thomas Kidd,
right?
yes,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah,
Mm.
Thomas Kidd, who had not gone to university. And to me, this is a little bit of a dig at the university wits at saying, "Hey,
Oh,
sure, I'm a witty fool, but that's better than being, a foolish academic
oh, I
who,
like that.
you know,
Yes.
yeah." All righty. So hooray for the witty fools.
So, what are you working on at the moment?
Oh,
I sense that you're deep in the throes of
oh
creativity
gosh.
and historical research, and you've
Well,
got
I'm
countless historical anecdotes on the tip of your tongues.
I have spent the last year and a half immersed in, the history plays and also Shakespeare's influences, which, took me way back to Homer. But
Mm,
I finished the influences, and so that meant that I needed to work on the current play, which is Shakespeare's Cast. And I'm not real happy with the title yet, because what I've got so far is Shakespeare's Cast, a guide to the characters in Shakespeare's history plays. But I'm a little bit worried that that sort of implies that I'm talking about what those characters do in the plays. And that's not the
okay, yeah,
thrust of the play at all. So that
yeah,
that that title may change, will hopefully change at some point. But I'm worried that it's going to be a paragraph long if
yes.
I
It muster the
explain all that.
barbers with your
Yes,
beards, yes, as
exactly.
Hamlet would put it. Yeah.
Exactly. So, but the point of the book is that uh, many of these characters had a real life and a historiography outside of the plays and long before the plays were written. And I start with Homer and then kind of, go through Antony and Cleopatra and Julius Caesar and take a little, self-indulgent detour into Macbeth, which is quasi-history, let's call it that. But then I go into the section that I call a plague of Plantagenets and the torrent of tutors. And uh, it's been quite the how to put this. um, it's sort of a cross between an adventure and just a relentless, constant research, exacting research, because uh, it's easy to get these characters confused, the real people behind the characters. Shakespeare himself conflates uh, a couple of, Somersets. Um, for some reason, he makes them into one person, and and so on. And there's the occasional guide online that will give you a little bit about the historical uh, basis behind some of these characters, but none that do the whole thing. And so that's really what's kept me going through this sort of Sisyphean task, because I will think, okay, I've got them all. I've got them. I've got all the characters. They're all in there. And the, oh no, oh no, William Stanley. I forgot William Stanley. How can I
Oh,
forget William Stanley? And there I am writing another another entry. Um, but fingers crossed, I've got them all. And now is the process of going through and just trying to make sure that I have every name correct, every date correct, because it's a nightmare. I am going to get something wrong. There is going to be
mm,
something wrong in my book. There is no way to avoid it. No author ever does avoid it.
no.
There's always something. But my goal is to not get anything wrong, and
Mm,
guaranteed, uh, with any luck, if people do read my book, that there will be people who know a lot more about that particular era or that particular person that I do, that is going to go, actually, dot, dot, dot. And so, I mean, I've written a stack of bibliographies, probably, twice as tall as I am, easily. Uh, you know, Gone through primary sources, read Holland's Head. Uh, it's been the journey, and I'm I feel very gratified to have had, you know, the opportunity to indulge in this. A writing contract gives you wonderful license to dive into a topic at a depth that you otherwise wouldn't. But oh my goodness, just doing the index um,
mm.
is a whole thing. And so uh, I, I'm supposed to be done in 2 weeks, and let's hope.
Wow.
um,
Oh,
it's at
wow.
it's at my copy editor now, my personal copy editor, not the one for the publisher. They'll get their turn later, but
Lucky them.
yeah. But I feel sorry for whoever. Thankfully, I don't have to apply the numbers to the index,
Mm.
um,
Oh,
because again, you've got a Somerset. Well, you've got to make sure the index lines up. So I've got all kinds of things in there to try to make this information easier to access. I've got tables. I've got an index of the characters specifically in the plays and what they're called there, so that you can go, okay, I want to see this Duke of Somerset. Which one is it? And then that index will tell you, okay, you want this this page, this date. I basically decided to arrange these, and again, we're talking about the Plague of Plantagenets and the Torrent of Tutors, to arrange these chronologically in terms of birth. So you go through and you go, oh wow, um, Henry the Second and Bolingbroke, Henry the Fourth. I mean, sorry, Richard the Second, and you see the problem I'm running into. Richard II and Henry IV were born, within months of each other. And, then you go along and you go, wow, uh, Lady Margaret Beaufort was really young compared to all these other people who were controlling her life, Henry VI and everyone else. Um, and I've got listed in their battle dates. So you're like, wow, this person was born right after this battle. It kind of it adds a dimension, at least for me, in terms of context that sort of allows you to kind of have a more of a feeling of what was going on, what that person was being born into. And to me, this feels very poignant, particularly for Richard III, because the life he was born into is horrific. It's just horrific. Everyone he knew was dying or being killed by someone else he knew. And so, when he goes on to kill all these other people, and I'm not even talking about the princess in the tower, I'm talking about Anthony Woodville and a bunch of other people who probably didn't deserve to be killed by him necessarily. Um, you can see why he thought this was a practical solution to his problems, all his problems. When all you've got is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. And for Richard III, all you've got is a blade. Every problem looks like an exposed neck to do away with. Um, and I don't know how that explains Henry VIII, but in any event, um, people are products of their time. And so I've really enjoyed this sort of chronological journey that I've been taking through all these lives. Uh, I do take some of the people, like married couples, and I address them as one entry. I list them by the date of their marriage. And I include some people that are not in the plays, like Edward III and Philippa of Hainault, because if you don't know about them, it's really hard to understand how their five sons caused all the problems of the Wars of the Roses when you
Well, I don't want
get
to give
right
you
down to
more
it.
work, but there is the reign of King Edward III, which is widely recognised as a Shakespeare collaboration. So it
Yeah.
only makes sense that Shakespeare would write a play on Edward III, and uh, that, funny enough, is a play included in a project that's taken up quite a bit of my
Uh-huh.
time, which is the proofs for Volume 2 of the collected works of Thomas Kyd. So
Oh, how
Edward
is that
III
coming along?
the proofs are wonderful. So chipping away at them and try not to go cross-eyed. Just go
Right,
through
right.
600 to 700 pages of proofs. But Edward III is
Wow.
is edited by Brian Vickers and the late great Shakespeare editor David Bevington. So, but if you add Edward III, I imagine that would probably give you quite a bit more work.
Well,
For
I'm
what does sound
already,
like a really invaluable study, though, Rachel.
thank you,
It
thank
sounds
you.
like it'd be incredibly useful for Shakespeare lovers, but history lovers as well,
I hope so.
and history lovers. Not to divide Shakespeare and history, of
No,
course.
no, I feel like this book is partly intended to create a bridge between
Yeah.
those two communities because historians understandably get annoyed with Shakespeare
Mm,
because he plays fast and loose with the historiography. And it's not his fault. He's following Hollinshead and, Plutarch and the sources that they had at the time. But, the only person telling those stories now is Shakespeare now. Nobody's reading Hollinshead anymore. So I was hoping that this would, in some ways, create that bridge. I also feel like, as I mentioned before, that getting to know these characters really enhances your understanding of the play. It
mm,
brings out the themes of the play in ways that
mm.
when you understand, oh, well, here's this minor character that said one word, upset because Henry VI has passed over his own son's inheritance to give it to Richard Plantagenet, Duke of York. But it turns out the character that did that had his own inheritance taken away from him and given to someone else. And so, these little cameos add these little layers of depth to these history plays that can feel a little flat if you, I feel like if some of them, if you don't know that stuff. Um, but mostly I feel, um, and you may feel this way as well, but this sort of tremendous responsibility to these people to tell these stories as truthfully as I can. They can't speak for themselves anymore. And here they
It
are,
reminds me of how the compilers of Shakespeare's 1623 First Folio described that project as an office to the dead.
exactly. Here they are, and really the only reason for some of these characters, the only reason we know of them at all is because of Shakespeare. And I feel like I kind of want to set the record straight
Hmm.
for some of them. In King John, Cardinal Pandolf is hard done by as far as I'm concerned. He's sort of uh, kind of shown to blame for the whole mess, and I don't
Hmm.
think it was really his fault at all. But anyway,
Hmm.
I've loved getting to know all these characters. I'll admit it's tad depressing. Sometimes I have to just put it away after I've read about, yet another atrocity. Um, and I don't go into those in a lot of uh, depth, but you also can't ignore them. You can't pretend that they didn't happen. Um, and you learn some amazing things. Um, One that I will talk about briefly, very briefly. So Charles VI was the King of France, and we know that he suffered from mental illness, uh, much as Henry VI did. Six was an unlucky number, apparently, but Charles VI, and he had barely survived something called the Ball of Burning Men. And what had happened is that they had thrown a party. His wife, one of the many Isabellas, um, perhaps an Isabeau, anyway, one of those. And he'd had his first kind of psychotic break about 6 months previous. And so their idea is, oh, let's keep everything happy, everything dancing. We're gonna have this party. And so he had this sort of uh, ne'er-do-well friend who said, okay, what we're going to do is us six guys, we're going to get dressed up in these rags, in these hemp rags, and we're going to go and we're going to be wild men, and we're going to go in there and we're going to make noises, and they're not going to recognize us. They're not going to know who we are. And we can do whatever we want. We can grab at the women. We can say lewd things. We can do whatever we want. And so they got dressed up in these rags and used wax to attach them to their bodies and chained themselves together to make this sort of, you know, kind of terrifying clanking noise. And, the queen said, "Oh, okay, but she said, okay, you can come in, you can do your shtick, your performance, but we're having no torches because that would be dangerous." Well, the king's brother shows up late to the party drunk, didn't get the memo about the torches, and a spark flies off from the torch, and the men all catch fire. And it turns into this nightmare. But
Oh
the
my
king
God.
had at that moment gone up to this woman, Lady Joan. I'm gonna butcher it. Diavoine. Anyway, she was a teenage girl at
We'll
at
put
the.
her on the screen.
Yeah, we'll put her on the screen. I'm sorry, Lady Jean. Um, Uh, but he had gone up to her to talk to her. She's a pretty young girl. Said, "Do you know who I am?" Blah, 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 blah. And when the sparks started to fly and everyone else caught fire, she took her skirts and wrapped them around him and
Wow.
saved his life.
Oh
One of
my
the other
gosh.
one of the other dancers jumped in a vat of wine, and
Mm.
it wasn't good for the rest of them. And also, several people attending the party also got injured because they were trying to save the lives of these men. So she shows up later in Henry VI as the woman who invites the wartime hero John Talbot over for dinner and tries to capture him, but he's too clever for her because he's John
The
Talbot.
Countess of Auvergne,
That's it.
if I'm
Thank
pronouncing
you.
that correctly.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, the
Is this
count.
the Talbot so much feared abroad? Yes.
Yes. Yes. And she makes an appearance there. And I think that it adds so much layers and so much depth to this scene because clearly she's very brave. Excuse me. She's very brave. She's known for her boldness and her quick thinking and her willingness to do anything, to
Mm.
save her country. And uh, yet at the same time would have reminded Shakespeare's audiences of what a mess the French court was
Wow.
during the reign of Charles VI. The French weren't too happy about it either, by the way.
Mm.
They were like, "What is wrong with our monarchy?" That this would happen. But
Wow.
um, it could not have been good for Charles VI.
I was totally unfamiliar with that story. Wow.
Right? How do we not know that? And yet
Oh wow.
it was only because of writing this book and going, okay, who is this lady? Why is this lady here? Because at first when I started writing these, I was like, oh well, this person probably isn't important. That person probably isn't important. But a lot of times, the more obscure they were, the more fascinating they actually turned out to be. So anyway,
Mm.
I've loved and despaired while working on this project, and I'm very excited to be coming near the end of it. And I want to put a shout out to my copy editor, Tamara Ann Alba. She's an incredible editor. If anybody needs one, feel free to ask. You can find her on Facebook, Tamara Ann Alba. And I just want to state too to anybody who wants to write out there. I was told all through childhood and high school that I could never be a writer because my grammar was terrible. And it's still not great. I'm going to say it's not good. But if you have yourself a good copy editor, and especially if you're lucky, one like me who has one who's studied Shakespeare, um, you should go ahead and write. So that will be out in 2027. And by our next recording, I'll be on to my next project, whatever that is. So I feel
Wow.
like I've
Yeah.
monopolized our writer's corner here, but I'm making maps, and that's a whole other kettle of fish, trying to make sure that those maps are accurate. But I'm
And I've
excited.
seen some of the visuals. It
Have you?
just looks stunning.
Oh,
Yes,
thank
yes.
you. Thank you. All right. And your Panto book so we were going to come
Yes.
up with questions. So, um, I'll tell you, why don't you talk about your writing and, and,
Yes. Well, I've had less opportunity to kind of bury my nose in the writing process. So kind of been chipping away at the writing. I've got
mhm,
the Thomas Kidd proofs. So volume two of the collected works of Thomas Kidd. So I'm associate editor for that edition. So Brian Vickers is the general editor. That will be out in April next year. I think early next year is a little bit of a bumper year for me, actually, because
Mm,
March, so the preceding month, is the paperback edition of Shakespeare's Borrowed Feathers. And in the meantime, when I find a rare opportunity, uh, when I'm usually exhausted on an
yeah.
evening, I am chipping away at the Shakespeare and Panto book, which revitalizes me. It's been
Yes.
great fun to write. Looking at Shakespeare, I think through the lens of British pantomime traditions
Mhm.
and panto-informed practices. And my latest chapter, which I finished the Shakespeare sections for, is on monsters and others. So you will find that there's often a monster in a pantomime, be it an ogre or a giant, or you will have a villain such as a wicked stepmother. And what's quite interesting as pantomimes have evolved over the years is that productions often seek a sense of redemption with these villains, that they get the
Mm,
opportunity to redeem themselves, whereas often in fairy tales they just get killed.
mhm,
So I've been looking at some of the monstrous figures in Shakespeare's plays, complex characters such as Caliban in The
mhm,
Tempest,
mhm,
or repentant Machiavel such as Edmund in King Lear, the
mm,
evil queen in Cymbeline, who has an unhealthy interest in poison, attempts to poison the heroine. The heroine falls into a deep death-like sleep and miraculously awake. And Cymbeline is considered by some scholars to actually be the first literary example of the Snow White narrative.
mm,
So I think that's quite fascinating. And maybe there were oral sources in circulation that the Snow White tale and Cymbeline owe
mhm.
a shared debt. But it's been so fascinating unearthing these correspondences and also thinking a little bit about early modern perceptions of monstrosity and evil during the periods. And I guess that would be my question for you, Rachel. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think what comes to mind is Bottom in
Ah, yeah, and
Midsummer
he's
Night's
called a
Dream.
monster, isn't he?
He's
Yeah.
called a monster because back then, a monster was any combination of two creatures that wouldn't
Mm,
normally go together. That was kind of the definition of a monster. And
mm,
so Bottom is a monster in the source of humor, but
mm.
you know, he would be absolutely terrifying.
Oh yeah.
I mean, it's kind of it's sort of a parody of Action, right? The deer-headed doomed hunter who glimpsed
Mm,
the goddess Artemis naked at her bath. Uh,
mm,
and then I think probably Thersites, who we were talking about earlier in Troilus and Cressida, is kind of monstrous in I mean he's described as having a pointy head and scraggly hair. So my hunch would be that uh that again kind of bringing up those fears. People didn't understand birth defects. They they didn't know anything about genetics. They didn't understand any of that. And so it was a common fear at the time that your baby might not turn out okay. And in fact, at the end of Midsummer Night's Dream, as Oberon and Titania are going through the palace, they're blessing the three new couples and saying that your kids are going to be great, no deformities, no disabilities. And that was one of the biggest blessings that they could give
mm,
at the time. So I suspect there was this constant kind of underlying anxiety, understandable, um,
mm,
of a fear of not so much monsters from the outside, but monsters that we might create ourselves.
It reminded me of King Lear, where I think the word monster appears over a dozen times. And in terms of being a curse rather than a blessing, you have that horrendous moment where Lear says of his daughter, convey sterility into her womb,
mm,
but also says that if she must have a child, make it a child of spleen, almost like this monstrous
yeah,
creature,
yeah.
which is a really horrific moment. Lear, for much of the play, is certainly a character more sinning than sinned against, I think.
I think
And yet we
so.
feel sorry for him by the end, which I think
Yeah,
very few writers capable of. It's that roller coaster of emotions I spoke about earlier.
I have to be feeling pretty tough to watch Lear, honestly.
Mm.
It's a hard watch for me.
It's no musical comedy. No.
Lear and Othello are a
Mm,
tough watch, but oh my gosh, incredible,
incredible.
incredible works, both of them. Uh,
Mm.
I think we might have mentioned this in one of the previous episodes, but again in Midsummer Night's Dream, um, uh, Thisbe, Flute as Thisbe is describing her her lover Pyramus, who's being played by Bottom, and she says he has eyes as green as leeks,
Yeah.
and that was a description of the monster Afance, who was a Welsh monster specifically. And so she is comparing him, saying his eyes look like a monster's eyes. He's
With cherry lips.
and yellow cheeks. How attractive. Yes. Uh, yeah, I can't wait to read your book. I'm glad you're finding little
Oh, I'm
times
really
when you can
enjoying it.
write.
Yeah, about 50,000 words in now.
Oh, excellent.
So we're getting there. That's what I've
Yeah,
managed to
yeah, yeah,
achieve
yeah. That's pretty good.
on the odd evening.
That's pretty good.
Uh, and tonally, I'm very much enjoying writing for a wider readership and
Hmm.
having the opportunity to incorporate some of my questionable humor as well.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, very much looking forward to it. Okay, and so my question for you was about Henry VIII, or All is True. And this is also a play that's very rarely performed and is sometimes accused of being Tudor propaganda. I didn't find it to be
Mm,
so. I find it to be anti-Catholic propaganda very heavily.
mm,
Um, but from what I understand, uh, we think it was written partly by John Fletcher. And
yeah.
what I'm kind of wondering is the play feels to me very Shakespearean in structure. Like this
Mm,
was one of the last plays that he wrote, and uh, would certainly have been acknowledged by Fletcher as a master of his craft at that point, right? We
mm.
can say that Shakespeare's in his early late 40s, early 50s at this point. Um,
Well, dates Henry VIII, or all is true, around 1611,
so
1612, some scholars
so
say.
late 40s, yeah.
So yeah, about 48, 47, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, what do you think in terms of the way the play is structured, the scenes that Fletcher is supposed to have written all involve these sort of conversations between commoners, almost kind of
Mm.
exposition about what's
Yeah.
going on. Uh, do you think that Shakespeare just didn't want to write those? And how do we know? How do we know that it was Fletcher that probably
Oh my
wrote
gosh,
those?
Rachel, I could speak for several hours about this, so I'll give a very Very brevity is the
Well,
soul of
all
wit.
right. Well, we'll make another episode where you could, but
Oh,
also
yeah.
I would like to remind our listeners that Darren is the hardest working man in Shakespeare podcasting, and you can find him on multiple podcasts discussing this very topic, and it's always interesting. I've listened to most of them, but tell us how we know that.
Yeah, so I think indubitably Shakespeare collaborated with John Fletcher on this play. And in terms of the play's dialogue, John Fletcher's is the dominant hand in this play, uh, which is not to say that it wasn't Shakespeare who structured the play, or conceivably they both sat together in the tavern and plotted the play together. And how do we know? Well, we believe that Shakespeare and Fletcher collaborated on at least three plays because we've
Mhm.
actually got contemporary evidence for two others. One is The Two Noble Kinsmen, where Fletcher and Shakespeare, which is quite a rare occurrence, are listed as that play's authors on the 1634 quarto edition. And there's also contemporary evidence that Shakespeare and Fletcher wrote a play called Cardenio for the
Mm,
King's Men. How we know it through a wide range of internal evidence, and I would recommend anyone interested in that topic to check out Brian Vickers's seminal study, Shakespeare Co-author, a historical study of five plays, which came out in 2002. And the Shakespeare Fletcher collaborations is something I also write about in my book, Shakespeare's Borrowed Feathers. But it the earlier scholars, beginning in the 19th century, noticed very different verse styles in that play. So Fletcher incorporates a lot more verse lines with extra unaccented syllables. Fletcher has a habit of concluding his verse lines with monosyllables,
mm,
which is quite un-Shakespearean, and also particular linguistic habits. So Fletcher very much likes using ye rather than thou or you,
mm.
and he very frequently uses apostrophe em rather than them. So that's just a very tiny snapshot into the kind of internal evidence that generations of scholars have noticed when it comes to
Mhm.
that play.
And do you think that they either didn't notice or didn't care? Or or is it more a case of, okay, you're better at writing these sort of informal exchanges between commoners in this case, if using the contraction M rather than
Mm.
them and saying the um,
I think it varies from play to play that we like to imagine a writing team saying, you're particularly good at this
mhm,
particular aspect of playwriting or these kind of characters. So you go ahead and write those scenes. In some collaborations, it does just seem that they've got their plot outline and just divvy their scenes out
right.
regardless. So I think you do get the sense with the Shakespeare Fletcher collaborations that Shakespeare is the more experienced writer,
Mhm.
that he is guiding his younger contemporary, but he seems a lot more hands off than he is with Thomas Middleton, with whom he collaborates on
Ah,
Timon of Athens. But Henry VIII is a very disjointed play in terms of characterization. I think
hmm,
a bit of a challenge for an actor playing Cardinal Wolsey, for example, where I think Fletcher and Shakespeare's approaches to that character are quite disparate, and that's caused a lot of headaches for scholars and creatives over the years.
well, I think it's interesting in that it also shows the two sides of Cardinal Wolsey
Mm,
that they're trying to show because
mm,
he starts out as this very sort of respectable and respected, most one of the most powerful men in the Western Europe at that point. Um, but botches it all by handing his private papers off to Henry VIII. And
mm.
that's quite the juxtaposition
mm,
of a character that there's a lot of inconsistencies in the man himself
mm,
to
mm,
start with. And so I I think that would be a strength. As a director, I would make the
mm,
most of those
mm,
inconsistencies, I think, uh, for the
mm,
actor in
mm,
wrapping their head around that role. I saw a production. I I use the Marquee streaming service. I think it was one of the Marquee um, offerings. They have a phenomenal Troilus and Cressida, by the way, and also an amazing King John, just beautiful. I think it's the RSC productions that they have. But
Is that the Choice and Cressida? Is it the Mad Max style Greg
yes,
Doran production? I
yes.
saw that in the theater and it was tremendous.
Oh
Yeah,
my gosh. Oh, it's so
yeah,
good.
yeah,
So
it really
good.
was. I just remember
Um,
the opening, which was just the roar of motorbikes.
oh my, I'm so jealous. I am so incredibly jealous right now. But what a fantastic production and really made me love the play. Um,
Yeah.
and I did not expect to love that play, but I truly do. But
Mm.
maybe we should indulge ourselves and have a bunch of episodes where we just talk about each play and why we love it so much.
Well,
We can
yeah,
do
we
whatever
can
we
change
want,
up the format. We
right?
can, the world's our oyster. Yeah,
That's
absolutely.
right. That's right.
Yeah.
Um, but I found myself, I watched it. I watched it twice. Once before I wrote about it, and then once after I wrote about it. And before I had written about all these people and all these characters, before I knew who all these people were, I was like, okay, it's a play. But when I watched it afterwards, it made me cry.
Mm,
So there's it can be very moving, and I think it was probably very moving
mm,
to Shakespeare's audiences. Um,
mm,
there's something poignant about Henry VIII um, protecting Thomas Cranmer at the end. Uh, there's something very cathartic about Wolsey, hanging himself by his own petard. Uh, I I think it can be a marvelous play. Um, I don't like to critique actors publicly, but I think uh, part of the problem with that production is that one of the main actors, it always shocks me. And I can't act at all, so far be it from me to think I could have done better, but it can it can add a flat note, and I think there is something about that production that I think. And but maybe, he was having troubles because of what you described. It, those parts can be very wordy. Um, and King Henry VIII, very kind of two-dimensional, kind of a cardboard cutout, really, of a character, um, because he's being shown as this sort of um, beneficent monarch, and we know too much about him
mm.
to believe that is part of the problem. And I
Yeah.
think it would take a really amazing actor to give us that suspension of disbelief, seeing
Mm,
King Henry VIII shown as this wise, gentle-hearted ruler. Um,
mm,
but that's fascinating, I think, and that we can see really who wrote what when just by looking at these sort of grammatical and syntax
mm.
ticks that we all
Yes.
carry with
And,
us,
and it requires a huge amount of evidence and using a
Uh-huh.
plurality of approaches, but I think it's beyond reasonable dispute,
All right.
John Fletcher's participation in that
All
play.
right.
Yeah.
Well, good job. Good job, John and Will. Well
Yes,
done.
yes.
Well done. All right.
Accelerating Wolsey's character arc. Well done. Yes, well done
Okay,
both.
so now if we haven't lost our entire audience, let's
I mean,
talk about
it's been quite a long one, this, hasn't it?
it has. I thought
It's
it was going to be short.
well, yes, yes. Well, I've
Uh,
enjoyed it.
oh, me too. Me too. The time has flown by. But we're going to give some quick book recommendations. Yeah?
Yes, yes. Shall I begin?
Yeah, go for it.
So, I was speaking about William Rowley earlier, who's a
Mm,
fascinating figure. So check out David Nichol, who's a wonderful scholar. His book, Middleton and Rowley, Forms of Collaboration in the Jacobean Playhouse. That's a fabulous study. Uh, Richard Preiss, Clowning and Authorship in Early Modern Theatre. I would definitely recommend. But I was also
mm,
talking about the possibilities of improvisation and improvisation being fundamentally lost to us. And I would
mm-hmm.
recommend having a read of Richard Price's chapter titled Undocumented: Improvisation, Rehearsal, and the Clown in the collection Rethinking Theatrical Documents in Shakespeare's England, which is edited by the great Tiffany Stern.
Oh,
I would also highly recommend. This is one of my favorite books, periods. Bart Van Ess's Shakespeare in Company, which is a wonderful account of the ways in which Shakespeare adapted his writing to suit the talents of players such as Kemp, such as Robert Armin. And finally, I would recommend David Wiles's Shakespeare's Clown and text in the Elizabethan Playhouse, and we'll link to each of those studies in the show notes as to her.
yes, we will. And I've got Shakespeare's Great Stage of Fools by Robert H. Bell, and he does a very nice survey of all the different clowns and fools and their parts. Um, for something a little wider range, I have The Fool in European Theater, Stages of Folly by Tim Prentke. Um, and pulling back focus even a little more, Fools and Jesters at the English Court by John Southworth. And I really
Mm.
loved this book. It was really well written.
I
It's
love John Southworth as an author. He's
Oh, do
brilliant.
you? Is he
Yeah,
good? He's
yeah,
good, huh?
very
Yeah,
good.
excellent. And there's they're black and white illustrations, but I'll take them. Um, and he does a really nice survey there. And then another one of my favorites is Fools Are Everywhere, The Court Jesters Around the World, and Beatrice K. Otto. And again, this pulls out the focus even more, gets a little more multicultural, which I appreciate the whole impetus human beings have for clowning and foolery and how that functions in our society. And finally, the book Fools and Idiots: Intellectual Disability in the Middle Ages. And this goes into depth more about that tradition and in all its downsides and upsides. I found it a fascinating book, really well written, a little more academic than the other books, but not impenetrable at all. Very clear, straightforward language. So
Hmm. Well, I think we've reached the end
I think we
of this
have.
episode. We've strived to please you every day, and thank you, and ever thank you to those of you watching and listening to Shakespeare and Friends. Until the next time, it's a festive farewell from Rachel and me.
Happy holidays.